in any case, if there's anything wrong, if you have any questions whatsoever, raise a hand, which is possible through Zoom. So, and hopefully I'll notice, and otherwise maybe Jonah can help out with any raised hands, etc. But even then, feel free to interrupt. It's no problem, because there's not that, it's not like a full lecture hall with 200 people, so it's not a problem. In any case, allow me to introduce myself. I am Michael Tai. I have been a student since 2008. I graduated the Dutch version of IBAP, so the economics and business economics course at ESE in 2011, and I graduated the master's international economics also at ESE in 2012. I started debating in 2010, which means that at this point, you might realize I'm old. I'm older than 30. My heart is breaking. One day you'll all be old as I am, and you'll have wrinkles, and you'll think, as you look at yourself in the mirror, where did it all go wrong? In any case, the amount of experience I've had in debating is, just like Jonah, quite a lot. I've had, I think, close to a decade, maybe more of debating experiences. I've given workshops to companies, to public libraries, to university multiple times, as well as, let's say, political parties, which I'm not allowed to talk about due to non-disclosure agreements. And I've also participated in tournaments. I've never won a tournament, but I have gotten to a lot of finals and semifinals and etc. I also give this kind of training. This one is adjusted to you as students, but I also give this kind of training to colleagues in the corporate world, etc. And I'm currently working as a business consultant. I'm a manager. It was a small / medium-sized consultancy company, but we just recently got acquired by Accenture. So I guess I work for Accenture now. In any case, that is my introduction for me. And I would like to take you all through basically the first lecture that we have in this long string of, what is it? What does it mean to start speaking? What is persuasion? What is debating? What is argumentation? In this case, I want to take you through roughly an hour and a half, an hour and 15 minutes of basically persuasion itself. There will be a bit about, argumentation, etc., but those are just references for later on lectures. And there will be a short pause in between of about 5 or 10 minutes in the middle of it. But, if everyone says, oh, I need to have a break right now, don't worry about it. Just raise your hand and just tell me. In any case, what is persuasion? Well, persuasion is quite simply the aim to convince an audience to believe something. Now, I would like to have, because I prefer to have this lecture done in real life, so we could, I could interact with the audience. But in this case, I'm just going to randomly ask people, to interact a bit, so we can have a bit of the feeling of what are your thoughts, what are your ideas, and also have the feeling of maybe COVID doesn't really exist, even though it does. So, what is persuasion? The audience believing something. Now, persuasion can be broken down into different forms. Persuasion can be a type of fact, type of opinion, and convince people of a certain emotion. Can you ever fully convince anyone of anything? That's the first question I have, people. What is the idea or construct of persuasion in your mind? And I'm asking you, the audience.
I think it depends on if they want to be persuaded.
Very good. Yep.
Yes.
Can you persuade someone if they don't want to be persuaded?
Most likely not, I guess. There's so many people speaking.
No.
I don't think you can persuade someone who doesn't want to, because it's about their ego.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Only maybe if you present something that is of their own interest and something that they feel like is very familiar to them. Mm-hmm. And if you kind of maneuver your way around that. But otherwise, it's kind of, if they have their mind set on something, they're probably going to stick to it.
Right. I would argue that some people could be persuaded even if they don't want to be persuaded. We're not all always hanging around our own egos to the point that like we refuse to accept any evidence. But some people will refuse to be persuaded no matter what.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree, but I feel like if you play with fear sometimes, regardless of like if you want to be persuaded or not, you will be able to find a way.
Okay. Buzz said something interesting in terms of, sometimes people have a bit of an ego. It's very difficult. And you just said something about fear. It's a bit difficult. It's a bit risky, I would say. But also sometimes you can persuade people, Karzan, what you said, depending on certain situations, even if they don't want to be persuaded. What is stronger? Persuading someone through logic, which I would attribute to people who don't want to be persuaded, but maybe through logic you can persuade them, or emotion, ego. What we just said, fear, ego. It's very difficult or maybe impossible to persuade people who don't want to be persuaded. Which one is more important in persuading people, logic or emotion?
I think it depends on the speaker. For me personally, it would be emotion for sure. But it also looks at the other person. They might be more conservative and look straight to the facts and logic. And another person might more work with the emotion. But I think you kind of have to aim for both, but just more one the other in each situation.
I guess it also depends on which platform you use. For example, I personally am way easier persuaded through emotions when it's the speech. But for example, if it's an article, I'm looking way more on facts. Or if it's something that will influence me, I'm also more likely to look on facts rather than emotions.
Okay. Any other, by the way, no one is really wrong here, but any other opinions in that sense? Thoughts?
I think emotion is more important. I once had a guy who taught about the brain, and I thought you had emotion played a much larger role than logic in your brain.
Right. Yeah. Essentially, we're more like animals than rational people. Yeah, I understand. Yeah. I'll be honest. From my experience, I have given roughly, I think, 1,000 speeches in my life. The amount of people I have persuaded or convinced of something is not very high. I think the average size of my audience is in between 5 to 500. So let's say the average, well, not average, but the median was lower. So let's say the average was about a crowd of 10, 15 people. The amount of people I've convinced per speech was no more than 1 or 2. Even though I have put a lot of effort into trying to increase my skill. The times where I was most effective and what I've noticed over the course of a decade of giving those speeches is that emotion is slightly stronger than logic, but that's primarily because the majority of people that you're talking to is used to speaking on an emotional level and not necessarily on a logical level as we might be on a university scale, right? So, but I will say that has been my experience. It's not necessarily always true. Sometimes logic weighs more powerfully with people who value logic more powerfully or who are able to keep a more calm approach, be a bit more detached from emotions and listen to them. My suggestion and the reason why I'm asking you this question is to really prime you for this whole session, is to think and look at what you're seeing and then think about, is this about logic or is this about emotion? What are the main building blocks of persuading someone, of convincing someone? All right. There are different forms to persuading. Now, when we're talking about persuasion, we're looking at 3 very basic principles that came from Aristotle, ancient Greek philosophers. There have been other styles, and let's say in the Eastern Asia, there have been other styles from famous speakers in different parts of the world. But more easily, in the Western European world, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, they're quite famous in that sense. And especially Aristotle thought about 3, well, technically 4, which we'll see, main principles of persuasion. The first one is ethos, which means an appeal to authority, or basically the ethic of a person. Credibility coming from, I am your boss, I am your professor, I have had this many years of experience, I've done this many times, and the persuasion comes from the fact like, oh, I trust you, and therefore I believe what you're saying. So I presume this is quite understandable. Second, pathos. That one, empathy, sympathy, the pathos comes from emotion. You're trying to appeal and persuade someone based on emotion. You're looking at, is the emotion genuine? Is the facial expression, is the body language real? Are they acting? Are they lying? Or is it genuine, let's say, courage? Or is it genuine fear? Or is it genuine guilt that you can see in the person who's speaking to then understand how effective they are in speaking? Pathos is generally part of persuading in the same way that ethos is, in the sense that when you find that someone is genuine in their emotions, we as social creatures realize that, well, there must be a reason for those emotions. Maybe they're angry because they were in a car crash, they lost someone special to them, and they are advocating for better road safety laws. And you can feel the pain in their voice, and you trust the pain in their voice. They're not acting, they're not lying, and you realize, I don't want to go through that pain either. So you're more likely to be persuaded by their argument, going like, yeah, I'll vote in favor of that road safety law, for instance. Right? That's markedly different from saying, I'm an architect or I'm an engineer and I've had 20 years of experience in saving people's lives by designing roads. Trust me, this is better. Of these two, which one is more effective, do you think? Or let me put it this way, which one do you see more often in the news or social media or whatever?
I mean, it's not even a contest, right? Like pathos, I would say for sure.
Yep. The next one, logos, which derives into logic. Then at that point, you're basically constructing an argument which people can follow causally from point A to point B to point C to point D, coming to a conclusion saying like, hey, we all like to live, point A, cars and roads are dangerous, point B, no one likes that, point C, point D, I think that these new road safety laws can be very effective because we've calculated it. And then the last conclusion is we should probably, because we all like to stay alive, we should probably implement these new road safety laws. That's logic. I haven't appealed to emotion. I haven't appealed to authority. I'm not saying I'm an engineer. I haven't calculated this. I didn't do the math, but I'm also not crying. I'm also not pleading. I'm not trying to work on your guilt. I'm just saying this will probably work. Compare that to ethos and pathos. And of these three types then, which one do you notice the most in the news from politicians or in social media or whatever? It's difficult, right?
Well, I think from the from the politicians, it's mostly the pathos. But it depends. Like when you go to the side of the of more like academic oriented papers, then logos will appear more often, I think.
Yeah, it's quite good. Again, there's no real wrong answer here. It's more that you try to understand where are the differences coming from and what are the differences. Obviously, what you want to try to have is when you have, because these are the basic principles, is when you give a speech and you try to be persuasive, you want to take into account these three principles, with the fourth one generally seen as an extra, which I would say, it's not the most important one because people tend to take this one as a more basic instinct. It's part of any natural time and natural occasion when you would give a speech. The fourth one, kairos, that one is about time. So whenever, let's say you talk in the future, like, oh, I've had a workshop about ethos, pathos, logos, kairos, and people who know about it, they'll generally just say only ethos, pathos, logos. Because kairos is about the right time and the right context. But these are things that you can prepare before you give the speech, right? You understand it before you give the speech. Whereas ethos, pathos, and logos is things you do during the speech. Now, kairos is generally audience, medium, occasion. So just a very simple example. Let's say there was just a huge accident, a huge tragedy. You're not going to give a very happy, cheery speech, obviously. If you're going to give a speech at that point, you're probably going to be very impassioned. Look at the loss of human life. It's been a tragedy. We must do something. Let's implement these road safety laws. We don't want this tragedy to repeat. Kairos is essentially the calculation you do beforehand, the preparation, understanding, okay, what kind of audience am I looking at? What kind of medium? Should I do it in text? Should I do it in real life? Should I give a movie presentation? Whatever, all those kinds of things. So, ethos, pathos, logos, those are the things you do during the speech. And usually when you combine the three of them, you're at your most effective. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you can always persuade everyone. Well, that depends on a few certain specific, let's say, factors, which we'll go back to later on in this lecture, such as audience, etc. But the takeaway is that you don't have to master every aspect. You don't have to be the most experienced person in the ethos part. You don't have to be super authoritative. You don't need to have decades of experience. You also don't need to have had a tragedy and have lost a lost one and lost a loved one, or be full of crying and tears and full of emotions that people are completely convinced, etc. You don't need that. You also don't necessarily need the most logical argument that is perfect, flawless from A to B, A to Z, etc. What is important is that these parts, when combined, can compensate each other for their weaknesses with their strengths and come together as the whole is greater than the sum of its parts to become a very persuasive, on a general basis kind of speech. Is that clear so far? Any questions? Again, these are just basic principles. So it's not like, they give you the perfect step-by-step guides to how to make the perfect speech. All right. No further questions? Then I'll continue. Now, speech anxiety. Anyone who has speech anxiety, raise a hand. You don't have to if you don't want to reveal yourself, etc. But yeah, okay. Speech anxiety. Yeah. Most people have it. I think the majority, well, close to a majority of people have like, whenever you get on stage and you talk to people, you go like, oh wow, my heart is, beating deep inside my chest. I can feel my mouth and my throat drying up, and I go like, oh, what am I doing? I'm afraid of forgetting all the words I have, etc. These are usually the first obstacles you have to deal with whenever you're going to give a speech, especially if it's something that you care about, right? If you give a speech to, your pet might probably not care because A, it doesn't understand language, but also, your pet will love you no matter what, unless you have a cat. It doesn't matter. In any case, let me reassure you, I also had speech anxiety in the past, but that went away after a lot of practice. But let me first go to the next slide. In any case, again, if you have speech anxiety, you're definitely not the only one. This is something that a lot of people even say like, oh, it's my worst fear. It's perfectly normal. What helps in combating speech anxiety is that, instead of thinking about self-defeating thoughts and sabotaging yourself, is instead using that energy of taking it seriously and trying to practice more and making a better speech. In any case, what it says here, at the bottom, kind of like take the fear of public speaking and turn the adrenaline into becoming a better speaker. Now, speech anxiety has that fear, and that fear can be used to basically fuel you and power you through into becoming a better speaker, in the sense of forcing you to take the preparation more seriously. But only preparing once for a speech can be very difficult. So, how do you prepare? How do you try to beat that nervousness? Well, for one, you have to realize it's okay to be nervous, right? It's, the nervousness is healthy, it's fine. And the feeling of I don't need to be nervous is actually, quite useful in the sense that nervousness can help you get through. Worst case scenarios are almost never that impactful. Second, perfectionist thinking. Wow. When you give a speech, and I had that in the past a lot, is when you think like, oh, I forgot to say this, or I misspoke here, or I had to recorrect myself, or I was dealing with an audience member who didn't like me and was looking at me horribly, or yawning. People in the audience were yawning. Oh no. Just like with catastrophic thinking, if you are thinking in a perfectionist manner, just think about, in the sense of, it actually doesn't matter. If I make small mistakes, that's normal. If I make small mistakes, that's perfectly fine. These kinds of ideas and thoughts can help you counter these two, ways of thinking, and make you less nervous in the negative way and make you more nervous in a good way. Now, desire for approval. You do not need everyone in the audience to agree. That's a very important one. But later on in your life, if you have a career, that might change. Sometimes you do need someone's approval, and it can be very difficult. If it's difficult to persuade them, then you go like, oh, well, then it's fine. But hopefully by that time you've practiced more and you can deal with it. Illusion of transparency. Again, a lot of audience members don't actually look at the mistakes that we make during a speech as we would think they do. When an audience member looks at you or hears you and you made a mistake by saying too much, or you made a mistake by moving your hands around too much, they might notice it a bit, but then they would usually immediately refocus on looking at you, saying other things. You keep talking, you keep doing this or that, etc. The only way the audience tends to detect your nervousness is if you just completely stop in the middle of a sentence and just leave. That's when they would think like, oh, something strange is going on, right? Because just like how a lot of people here raise their hands with speech anxiety, that's how most audience members are in real life as well, because this is something that the majority of human beings have. So because they realize that a lot of people have a bit of speech anxiety, they do tend to think that, actually your speech was pretty good. I don't think I could have done any better because I always get so very nervous. So the audience's ability to detect nervousness is generally not that good. So these 4 ways of thinking and counter thinking essentially can help you get over that nervousness a bit. But the main thing is definitely practicing. Practice, practice, practice. How many times do you think I needed to practice in terms of number of speeches? Each speech is about 5 minutes, let's say. How many speeches do you think I needed to make before I stopped being nervous?
I think like 50 in a row. Very together.
Nope. Anyone else? Another guess?
I
think you cannot stop to be nervous. You always have that feeling.
Yeah, that's what I was actually going to suggest. It's a trick question as well, and you're still
a bit of a
nervous.
trick question. Yes, I always get a bit of nervousness, except when I'm in the zone. And the zone it's terrible that I say it this way, right? But I think you're all either millennials or Generation Z. It doesn't matter, but you get what I mean with the zone, where you're so focused on the one topic and the one object that everything goes away and you're focusing only on that. It wouldn't matter if people in the audience were, making out or getting drunk. I would still be just completely unfazed and continue. I've only had that a very few times, and that happens when I'm genuinely wanting to win so badly, or that the topic is such a passion point for me that all other feelings fall away. So those would be let's say semifinals that I've had, or when I was debating in Oxford in one of their very prestigious halls, etc. That was so much fun that I just completely forgot about everything. But getting into that zone, even then, the first time I got it was only after about 300 speeches. It took me 3 years to get to that point. Right? But still, even to this day, if I have to give a speech, I still have that healthy bit of positive nervousness where I go okay, I'm feeling it. I should practice a bit. It's forcing me to get into the mood, trying to get into the zone and understanding okay, I can get over that little bit of anxiety and talk to people in a normal way as I would usually do when giving a speech. Practice, practice, practice. I can't promise that if you give 300 speeches, you'll get to the same point as I do, but my recommendation is definitely practicing. All right, presentation skills. What do you think people remember when they meet you for the first time? Anyone?
Your attitude and what you said, and like your, I guess, energy, how you stand, facial expressions.
Yep. Anyone else?
I think they only remember like your overall vibe and maybe how you said bye. That's about it, honestly.
Yeah. So when it says here, landing the handshake, making eye contact, remembering the name, is that important? Or is it more important than your general vibe?
No.
I personally think like things like making eye contact is very important because that's how you make connection with other people. Thus your message or whatever actually like reaches way easier.
Okay, well, these are good answers. I would say very correct in the sense that the general vibe tends to be more important, but eye contact, it is sometimes, not always, an essential part of your general vibe. First time making eye contact can be important, but sometimes if a person doesn't give you eye contact, it's not a big deal because they themselves don't value it as much. The 7-38-55 rule is, the numbers are a bit awkward perhaps, but it's quite a useful number to remember, or numbers to remember, I guess. Let's say less than 10%, less than 40%, and over half, is that you realize people tend to not listen to the words you say, ever, at all. I've had multiple times at my work where people who earn more than I do and are my boss or my boss's boss or my boss's boss's boss, that they just look at me and go like, oh, okay, you're good. Can you help me? Yeah, sure. And then I say something and then they just forget. And then the next day they send me an email and I just go like, yeah, I already told you. Oh, I forgot. Can you send me an email? Because they only read the email. They don't listen to my voice. But they like me and they trust me. And that's only because I come across as a person who both works for them and is reliable. That's it. I don't do much, but they're fine with it. The same thing happens with at least what politicians try to emulate. They focus on the body language, they focus on facial expressions, because they realize that the majority, because we said early in the session, someone said that most of the politician speeches are based on pathos, trying to appeal to the emotion of people, is that politicians try to emulate this specific part. They try to focus on giving that good, reliable, trustworthy general vibe. Because they know, just as you and I might know, is that in an election and during an election campaign, it's almost impossible to handle every topic, every subject, and give out every logical argument why their position or why the political party is good or better than the alternatives. Instead, what they do is say like, well, I don't have 10 hours to convince you of everything. Instead, it's far more cost effective to focus on your emotions. Who am I as a person? You can trust me. I'm reliable. Look at my body language, my facial expression. I'm open. I'm here. Trust me. Does that make sense? All right. Well, let's look at an example.
This country has more.
Oh, can you hear him?
But that's not what makes us rich. We have the most powerful military in history, but that's not what makes us strong. Our university, our culture, the envy of the world, but that's not what keeps the world coming to our shores. What makes America exceptional are the bonds that hold together the most diverse nation on earth. The belief that our destiny is shared, that this country only works when we accept certain obligations to one another and the future generations, so that the freedom which so many Americans have fought for and died for comes with responsibilities as well as rights, and among those are love and charity and duty and patriotism. That's what makes America great.
Question to you all. What did he say?
I mean, it's a little bit of an unfair question. I feel like, considering like that people aren't like speech absorbers.
Exactly. Yeah, it is an unfair question. Whenever I've done this multiple times, I show a clip of different politicians. Sometimes I give a speech myself. People almost never listen. They look at, oh, the first thing they go is like, oh, Obama, or oh, the trainer is giving a speech, or oh, there's a nice little YouTube clip. Let's look at it. Oh, there's an audience. Oh, they're waving. Oh, the American flag. Oh, what is this? Oh, it's a victory speech. They're already forgotten the first 30 seconds. Then they go like, oh, the trainer just told me I got to look at his body language, or, that was the most important part. I'm going to look at his body language. And then they go like, oh, his body language, wasn't that something they said during 2012? Maybe some of you might be too young to remember. And they go like, well, they did say you had a good body language, better than Mitt Romney, who ran against him back then. Or, he is supposed to be a very charismatic person, very charismatic talker. And at that point, you already missed the first minute of the speech. Then he says something like patriotism, America great. That's about it. Usually people tend to not really listen to any of the words. People hear them, people know what he's saying, but do they really listen? It's debatable. Again, this is not always the case. There's a lot of people who do listen, but in general, a lot of people look at the vibe, look at the person. Are they open? Are they trustworthy? What is their general atmosphere? Now, here you have some quick tips. You can go back later on and go through the movie, like what is he looking at? What is he doing? What's the volume? How's his speaking pitch and tempo and all those kinds of things? And they can help you understand like what is he actually doing. The takeaway, however, is that there is no perfect speaking style. Does anyone disagree?
I guess I would say that there are bad speaking styles, but yeah, I think it really depends on the person. And as you said, also the audience you're speaking to. So I would agree with the fact that it's not perfect. There's no perfect speaking style.
Do you have an example of a bad speaking style?
Well, if you ask me that, of course, I'm not going to think about any. But I would say, I mean, if you look at politicians, right? They normally talk about, or like what Obama did now, or like America's great and like we are great and like, yeah, all of that. That would not cut it in a lecture hall when a professor would say that. So it really depends on the audience you're directing your speech to, right? So I think there are multiple good speaking styles, but you have to direct it. Like you have to direct it to the people you're speaking to. I'm sorry, I can't actually think about a bad one right now.
Let me pose a question to everyone. Who here thinks that Trump has a good speaking style?
I think he knows his audience really well, and I think people don't actually give him enough credit for the fact that he gives. I think, and like it's very easy to mock him for the way he speaks, but he has a crowd and he knows the crowd. And I actually think if you look at that, he's a damn effective speech giver because he manages to rile up crowds really quickly, even when he's not really saying very much. But what he does say manages to somehow connect with the people that he needs to connect with, which is his base.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I completely agree with you. So when it says there is no perfect speaking style, we don't say there is no bad speaking style. You can just say nothing. You can fling poop. That's bad. That's exaggerated, of course, but in the sense that there's no perfect speaking style, in the same way that you cannot convince everyone. Combining ethos, pathos, logos perfectly does not mean that you can convince everyone, because everyone is different. Everyone is unique in that sense. And just like how Trump can convince his audience and his own through his own style of speaking, you and Obama has a different way. There is no perfect speaking style. So finding your own is the best way forward. But that's only possible if you practice a lot. For me, that took at about in between 75 and 100 speeches to really get in there, like, okay, this is my style. I recognize it. I know it. It's perfect. But I was already approaching my own style, like realizing I didn't like this. I didn't like that. I knew what I wanted a bit at around 20 to 25 speeches. I already knew, like, okay, I'm not the kind of person who can command or talk about this, or I'm not the kind of person who can talk about that. I prefer to be a person who focuses a bit more on the logos. I'm a person who prefers more to talk about the pathos. I have found I really don't like ethos. I don't like it because I'm not that kind of person who likes bragging, and that's maybe part of being very Dutch and Dutch raised, that I don't like to brag about, doe maar gewoon, dan ben je al gewoon genoeg, etc. Be normal and then you're good enough, in the sense. It's a Dutch saying that it's never been part of my speaking style. I would prefer to just start off with logos and a bit of pathos to begin with. Does that make sense? Okay, so here, choose a speaking style according to the occasion, recognizing the audience, and choose a couple of areas to try and improve. Those are all very important, but they also become clearer as you go through the lecture and as you practice. So what are parts of those speaking styles that you can, those areas that you can try to improve? Well, I'm going to go through this part a bit faster because you can go through this afterwards, but some of those areas in public speaking that you can improve on, that you can think about, would be, for instance, volume. Right? You need to be heard. Think about the distance. Don't talk too loud, but don't talk too soft. Just think about, and especially if you're preparing, go ahead and sit in the audience and think about the voice, or have someone else talk at a level you're like, okay, I can understand, I can hear it, and then continue. Pitch. Don't do like this. I should do that. Don't try to be overly low, right? But don't be monotone. Try to vary your speech. Try to vary the way you talk. Same with speaking speed. When I'm in a competition, when I used to debate at universities, trying to get into the finals, trying to win a competition, you only have 5 minutes or 7 minutes max. I would speak very fast because I knew that the judges were used to it and the judges could keep up. But if I'm talking to general members of the public, I'm talking a lot slower. Because just like with the speech of Obama, people tend to not listen to what you say. And as you realize that, you realize, oh, I should just talk slower. I can make my point easier and they can pick up what I'm saying. Eye contact. Now you see a very nice little red dot over here. That is something that I tell people to look at. Specifically, whenever you give a speech and people give you tips like, oh, you need to look them in the eye, or tips like look at the distance in the wall, or look at the clock, or all those kinds of things. What you're actually trying to do is a battle between two things. On one hand, you have trying to make a connection with the audience, trying to give that pathos a go, right? You're trying to get that emotional connection going. And on the other hand, you're trying to not distract yourself. What if you're looking at someone and they stick out their tongue, they're yawning, or you're looking at the clock and the clock stops moving, you get all distracted, like, oh, I only have 5 minutes left for my speech, or I need to finish this presentation in the next 10 minutes, etc. That can be distracting. Whereas if you look at the wall, people might notice it and you might lose the connection. So generally, people tell you, or at least give you the advice of look at people's eyes. But for a beginner, and especially if you have a lot of speech anxiety, that can be very difficult to do because eyes can be very distracting. Especially, let's say, if it might be a fellow student and you might have a crush on them. You can get completely flabbergasted and go, oh crap, I shouldn't have looked at that person. What helps, and I recommend doing this at home after this lecture or whatever, if you stand in front of a mirror, whatever distance, it doesn't matter, you look at the point where the red dot is. Go walk forward, walk backward. Only look at that specific dot on your own face. You will realize that your eyes are imperceptibly still looking at you. So you're making that connection, but you actually are not looking at your own eyes, so you're not being distracted. Looking at the red dot on a person's face is enough to make an emotional connection from the audience point of perspective, while not distracting yourself. That dot has helped me a lot because you can fake eye contact. Is that clear so far? Again, there are other tips here as well. Yeah. Okay. Face and body signals. Well, these are, good tips to have. Just like arms at the side, open, straight back. Try to look confident. Have the open, clear, trustworthy, reliable vibe. Try to put your shoulders over on, your back straight, shoulders over over your feet. In a sense, don't have your shoulders over your toes. Don't have your shoulders all the way to the back. Don't have your arms crossed or don't be hunched over. Again, very useful. But when you develop your own speaking style and you realize that you prefer certain ways, there is a balance where at one point you can say to yourself, I actually really like leaning over. I actually really like using my arms crossed when it fits the mood. Let's say you're in a speech and you're really mad about something. You're trying to really connect with that pathos. And the only way you can convey that at the moment is crossing your arms, showing your displeasure. Well, then cross your arms, whatever feels natural, but practice it. And you'll realize that when you get to your own natural speaking style, that the tips fall away because they're good beginner's guides. And it's more about how your own style fits you, giving you the confidence to speak and giving you the ability through that confidence to focus on what you're saying and how you're saying it, instead of trying to think, using that spare brain capacity, how I should convey myself. You only have so much brain capacity. If you're constantly thinking about how to stand and how to use your body, etc., you won't have enough brain capacity left over to think about what you're going to say next. That is also why you should practice a lot, so that you can get used to your own speaking style and become not just more confident, but also so used to your own body language that you have enough brain capacity left over at the moment to focus on your speech. Is that clear? Hand gestures, very good tips in here. Think about them. What can show indifference? What can show confidence? What shows the opposite? What is eccentric? Yes or no? But it's very useful to practice that with someone else. And the tips here, you can, as a reference point, you can look at that later, but they're all very useful. All right. Filler words. A lot of people say a lot. You'll notice that sometimes I say but it might be less than some people you're used to. Sometimes you might not even notice when people say a lot. That's fine. What helps is that you don't try to think about it. Don't try to get into that catastrophic way of thinking, all the way back a few slides earlier with the catastrophic thinking of, oh, I need to be perfect, or it's going to be horrible, people are going to notice I say too much. That's not a problem. If you want to, try to minimize the amount of you're saying, it's absolutely fine if you're silent. Just like I'm doing right now. It looks professional and thoughtful. Even though at this point, I'm just thinking, I had a really great dinner. What should I eat tomorrow? Doesn't matter. People can't read minds. That's fine. Second one is be prepared. Practice your speech over and try to minimize the amount of ums, which comes from practice. Just fine. The last one, language choices. If you're with, let's say, you have an audience with the king or queen, you want to use formal words. You are talking to children, you want to use simple words. You are talking to your professor, you need to use jargon that the professor understands. If you're talking to lay people, general audience members, you need to talk in general words. So it's very understandable, but the best way to get to it, just like everything else, practice, practice, practice. Clear so far? Now, focus on, again, you can practice this, but focus on volume, pitch, speaking speed, eye contact, body signals, hand gestures, filler words, language choice. But look at Obama now as he was at the beginning.
And I remember the Black Law students had organized an orientation for the first year students. And one of the persons who spoke at that orientation was Professor Bell. And I remember him sauntering up to the front and not giving us a lecture, but engaging us in a conversation and speaking the truth and telling us that he had to learn at this place. That I've carried with me ever since. Now, how did this one man do all this? How did he accomplish all this? He hasn't done it simply by his good work and easy charm. Although he has both in affirmation. He hasn't done it simply because of the excellence of his scholarship. Although his scholarship has opened up new vistas and new horizons and changed the standards of life.
What are people's thoughts about this, about the difference?
You can see a clear change in his posture. Like you can see like his hands pockets while he's standing very loosely with his shoulders like slacked. Because he has his hands in his pockets, he looks slightly less confident. And because he has hands in his pockets, he also doesn't draw attention as much as he did in his later speeches, where you can see he makes a lot of use of his hands to emphasize his words.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah,
In the hands.
yeah, I would say that he's speaking in a very like intense tone of voice, but his body language is like very relaxed, so it creates a contrast.
Yes, very good.
I think the hand in the pocket is the most distracting one. That is just like the first thing you see when you look at him, like where the hand goes all the time.
Yeah. Another question to people. Did you hear what he said?
No, but the volume on the video is too low to hear.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah, I was about to say it was a bit unclear to hear anyways.
No worries. In that case, I would suggest try and go through these slides, you know, the various things that you can take up on for, you know, the speaking styles, etc. Look at the old one and then pump up the volume and look at the new one, or at least most recent one from 2012, and notice a difference. And that's what a lot of practice can help you change, etc.
Can this he has his hands in his pocket, but can that not be a sign of confidence, that you put your hands in your pockets, that you think, yeah, I'm so confident, I don't have to stress about it?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. But what's awkward is where he takes his hand out of the pocket, puts it back in, takes it out, puts it back in, takes it out, puts it back in. So when I need to, well, go through the video later again, you'll see that he does it multiple times, where he takes his hand out of the pocket, back in, out, back in, back, out, back in, etc. If you're confident, your body language is more direct. So you only take it out once, make a few hand gestures, and maybe you let it rest somewhere. Doing it in rapid motion, back, out, etc., that's less confident. So it tends to be seen more as informal or not used to it. So my suggestion at that point is usually when you're practicing it, try to just, you know, keep your hands out and see what happens and practice it that way, which Obama tend to do. That doesn't mean that keeping your hands in your pocket or your arms, you know, crossed over, etc., is not necessarily a bad speaking style. I have seen speeches. So one was from I think it was from person from Harvard or Yale, I don't remember. They were speaking in the 2000s, I don't remember, 2010, 2011 World Championships finals. This was in Ireland, if I remember correctly. And the person who won, or the team who won, and the person who was speaking, had his arms crossed the entire speech. And then he was talking, he was like going like this, like, and my point is this, and my point is that, etc. His arms were continuously crossed. But all it showed was that he was angry. and the topic was about abortion, and he was, you know, justifiably angry about a lot of things, and it actually helped his speech. Not for everyone. There were still some people who thought it looked weird, but a lot of people thought like, oh, this fits the style of speaking. It's fine. So very correct. There is not a 100% incorrect way of body language, style, etc., unless you just, you know, use your middle finger and flip everyone off continuously. But as you say, you know, keeping your hands in your pockets can be a sign of confidence. Just make sure that it's not only that, unless you're very practiced. Again, here's some stuff, you know, like just like what Bianca said, very good, you know, indications of what is a good speech, what is a beginning speech, etc. And you can look through that. Okay, I'm gonna skip through this one because I don't like the guy. So we'll just, you know, the clip is I think 2 minutes, which is way too long. I'll just show it for 10 seconds and then, you know, you get the point.
Of hospitalizations are right now China virus. So think of that. So our hospitals are ready if something should happen. But that's what I appreciate that. We simply trust you. We can. We are doing the greatest job of this job. Europe imposed crushing lockdowns today. Spain has more than 2 times more new cases per capita than the United States.
Yeah, okay. Okay, that's more than enough than I can handle. In any case, Trump talks to his people, and you know, this segment is about audience. So Trump does not use a standard speaking style, but is adapted to his audience. I agree completely what it says here, right? Blunt, vulgar, simple use of language, repetition of keywords and phrases. He uses, you know, he sits like this, like, oh, this guy over here. And, you know, he has a hat on, makes him look mysterious, dark eyes, like a dark, brooding, handsome man that he wishes he could be, but never was, etc. Right? Now, at the beginning of this, you know, lecture / workshop, I asked, there are, you know, 3 things that really focus as basic principles for a speech. Ethos, pathos, logos. What is Trump focusing on the most?
Definitely emotion.
What kind of emotion?
I think, well, in general, he really aims at the kind of naturalistic sense of the of his people. And in this sense, it's also kind of about getting a bit of superiority. Look what these people are doing, and look how we are better than them because of what we are doing, which like it stands a bit of pride, I guess.
No. What is the underlying emotion that he's trying to capture? Right?
Perhaps vanity?
Sorry, say again?
Perhaps vanity?
Vanity, yeah. A bit of narcissism, a bit of pride. What does that do with fear?
I mean, from like the way Trump speaks, I would say he uses fear in a way of saying that other people will make things bad. So that I would say that's how he uses fear.
And how does he use that to reinforce himself?
He basically puts other people down. Look what they are doing, and look how much better I can do it. And because of the confidence he uses in his words and his speaking, that is something people really like react to.
Yeah.
He speaks like an expert, even though he isn't.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, that's correct. Trump is talking to people and trying to make them feel good. I'm just like you. I'm just as tough as you. I talk to your vanity, to your ego, to your narcissism, to whatever. But he also understands, or maybe he doesn't understand, and he's just got lucky with his speaking style. But he also understands that there is an opposite effect to that. When you embolden people, you also take something away. You take away their fear, or you help them mask their fear, or at least you allow them the excuse to not think about their fear. I don't have to be afraid about China. I don't have to be afraid of the virus. I don't have to be afraid of Europe. I don't have to be afraid of all those horrible things. I can listen to a man who tells me everything's going to be all right, as long as I vote for him. right? That's essentially, in a nutshell, populism. Now, understanding that, looking at a type of speech and then realizing, or perhaps it doesn't always have to be about the first thing you see, it could be about the thing that it's countering, right? So the vanity, the ego, the I'm going to make you feel better is countering the fear, can help you realize that just because someone is talking in a specific way does not mean that the audience is the exact mirror. The audience might be the opposite, and what you're trying to do is get rid of a specific feeling in the audience, so in this case, fear, by heightening the opposite emotion, courage coming from undeserved confidence. Does that make sense? Yeah. Now that is exactly how you can try to think about types of audiences and how to approach them. Now the types of audiences here, so there's a couple, right? You have a captive audience, doesn't choose to listen to a given speech. They're voluntarily, right? So a child being scolded by a parent, they can't leave, they're stuck. A mandatory lecture for, a study you have to go through. Well, you can choose to stop your study, you can choose to stop your course, but generally you're kind of captive. And the way you deal with that is not necessarily going like, as let's say you're a professor and you're giving a lecture and you go like, oh, I know you're all stuck here. No, that's not a great introduction. Instead, you might want to focus on the opposite reaction. Make them want to be there. So how do you make people want to be there? Instead of going like, oh, I know you're stuck here and you're a captive audience, blah, blah, blah. You can go like, hey, you're so lucky to be here. Why? Because my course is going to help your career. My course is going to help you understand blah, 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 blah. In a sense, you engage them. What it says here, capture the audience's attention in the introduction, make them feel wanted, make them feel that they want to have this. In the same way, as you continue on with, let's say, a committed audience, someone who voluntarily does that. So you listen to your favorite writer, you listen to a podcast, you listen to your favorite news host or talk show host or whatever, you already tend to agree with them. Then it's very easy. So you don't have to try to think about like, okay, how can I, change their emotions? How do I target them? How do I target their emotions, etc.? You're already, at the spot where you want to be. But other types of audiences, so if I continue further, let's say a contrary audience, audiences that are there to oppose you. So let's say you're a left populist politician who is faced with right populist movement, or the opposite, a right populist politician who is faced by left populist opposition. Right? People can be very hostile. The way you focus that is not by focusing, or at least try to attack it or address it or try to persuade people, etc., is not by trying to make it more hostile. You kind of do what Trump does. You focus on the positive things that can counteract the negative things. So be objective, be reasoned, go like, okay, let's compromise. Let's be, reasonable adults. Where can we aim for a positive atmosphere? How can I help you address your fears? Concerned audience, similar to committed, right? They agree on a more emotional level, like, yeah, there's something bad going on, we're concerned, but we're not fully committed. Convince us to vote for you. Why is your specific idea good? In that case, you already know what kind of emotions they might have, and you can inspire the audience by giving good logical arguments. Like, hey, I know you're all afraid, and I have this great thesis or project. I've all calculated it out, and then we can tackle this problem together. Another type of audience, casual audience, those are just people with casual interest or curiosity, going like, just walking by, maybe going along. In that sense, trying to engage them with authority or connection, making that curiosity and interest come up, is also very important. Now, these 5 types of audiences. Which audience are you currently in this lecture? I can cycle through them again. Captive, committed, contrary, concerned, casual.
Casual, I would say.
Okay. Anyone else?
I think
Stay committed.
I think a mix between casual audience and committed audience, because in a sense we have to follow these career skills courses, of course, but like within that framework of career skills, we can we receive the option to follow the public speaking course. So I was enthusiastic about this course. So in that sense, I'm a casual audience.
Yep. Anyone else?
I would say committed, because I think everybody in this meeting has had a choice to do this or do something else. So
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah. Yeah, that's nice. And it tends to change your motivation and how you listen to it. And it changes how I talk to you and how I try to interact with you in terms of trying to, tell you everything I want you to know. If you were a captive audience and you had to do this mandatory, I would have done it differently. I would have, well, for one, probably insisted on trying to do this in real life, and then gave you different kinds of speeches and show you the different effects of practicing a speech and how one can go from, dealing with speech anxiety to then being able to improvise a speech on the spot and show you, look, these are the effects you can have. That tends to change people from captive to either committed or casual. Going like, oh, this is actually quite nice, like I enjoy listening to this, or it has some interests of mine that I share. Again, just like how you cannot convince everyone, it's not possible to change everyone within your audience from one type to another, but it is possible to generally change the type of audience you're dealing with. And it's always very good to try and change your captive audience or into a committed audience, and change your contrary audience into a concerned audience. Your casuals are just nice, it's fun, you can have a drink with it. It's not a big deal. Now, what's also important about audiences, and this specifically helps you in understanding what kind of audience you're dealing with, is thinking about the kairos again, the fourth principle, right? What is the context of it all? If I'm talking to students, if I'm talking to career professionals, if I'm talking to a group of CEOs, if I'm talking to a judge, if I'm talking to a doctor, etc., these are all different things. If I'm talking to my family, I talk very differently than if I talk to my colleagues. And also, understanding the context helps me realize, should I, all these previous things with the speaking styles, what kind of words, what kind of ways of eye contact, etc., should I use? They all fit in together to help your ethos, pathos, logos come to, I would say, a better persuasive speech. Because targeting your audience specifically helps you shed excess waste. It's more efficient. So it's not that your speech is terrible by definition if you're not targeting your audience correctly, but it becomes simply more effective. Okay. Is that clear so far? All right. Structuring your speech, last part. Now, why is structure important? It says here very clearly, clarifies the content, the location of a plot, in the sense of if I have multiple arguments, let's say it's about childhood obesity, and I'm talking about health benefits, but also mental health benefits. I'm talking about lower healthcare costs throughout society. Those are different points. If I have a structure where I say, hey, I have 3 points. 1 is about the physical health of the child, 2 is about the mental health of the child, and the 3rd one is about the healthcare costs of society. Then people realize when I say that in the introduction and I clarify the content of my speech, I structure. I go like, hey, remember first point? Let's talk about the physical health of the child. It's very important because we all care about it. Blah, blah, blah. Right? It can help people realize and understand, where was I? Where was he? What am I listening to? Because people don't listen to words that much. Let's say I'm done with that part of the speech and I go on to the second. Like, hey, remember the second part? Second part was mental health. People go like, oh yeah, mental health. Right. It's quite important. Fat kids get bullied all the time. That's not good. They can get depressed. That's not healthy. That's not good. They might become suicidal. We don't want that, etc. They're just as worthy as us, blah, blah, blah. Right? But in the same way that you need to have an introduction and you're talking about the arguments, so the body of your speech, you also need to have a conclusion, a summary at the end of your speech. You can go back and say like, hey, I just finished argument 3. I go like 1, remember about that physical health of the child, that's important because of this. 2, mental health, 3, healthcare costs in society. People go like, oh yeah, you repeated it. Now I remember again. That's very nice. Thank you, speaker. I can remember your words better, meaning that the third principle, logos, sticks in people's heads longer. And again, you need all 3 principles to more effectively persuade someone. Of these 3, which one is the most important? If there is one that is the most important.
I think the introduction. No, wait. I think the conclusion, because you stated that at the beginning of like all the speeches, a lot of people are first like looking at the entertainer, and they're not really receiving the information. I think during the body, a lot of info is missed, so it goes in one ear and it goes out through the other ear. But I think in the conclusion, they can connect the dots again, so they've heard different stuff, different clouds of information, and then they can draw the lines between all those clouds of information by summarizing the main points of your speech.
Okay, good point. Good point. Thank you. Louisa, you raise your hand.
Yeah, I agree with that point. I also think that the conclusion is very important for the points mentioned before. But I do think that, as you have mentioned, having a good introduction, so good ground to stand on, is also really important, so that the body doesn't become all like one cluster of stuff, but that people actually are able to listen to your body and your conclusion. Because if they don't have a structure at the beginning, it's basically you just ranting something totally random. So mentioning the things that you're going to talk in your body and maybe like the general topics or how these things correlate to each other helps people actually listen to your speech. So I would say that introduction is the most important because it helps people actually listen to your entire speech.
Very good, thank you. Any other thoughts, ideas, counterpoints? Anyone?
I think introduction and conclusion are both equally, well, not 100% equally, but similarly important, because you need a good start. Because like if you don't hook people at the beginning, then they don't care, and your conclusion can be as nice as it wants to be. But if I don't care from the beginning, then you've lost your audience. But at the same time, people remember the conclusion. And it's also kind of this idea that if like a lot of like really good speakers, they kind of have somewhat of an, like, not necessarily a story arc, but some sort of plot that goes through their speech. And people usually remember the beginning of that, and they usually remember a good end. So if you have a good beginning and a good end, your body doesn't even have to be that good for people to remember the speech as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I really think introduction is more important than conclusion, even though it's pretty close, because your conclusion can be great. You can say all the right things, but if you have not made an introduction, it sounds weird, but the audience doesn't really know who you are. There is no connection to who you are, your tone, what you were saying, what you stand for in the subconscious way. Thus, your conclusion, as no matter how good it is, will never have as much impact than if you had a good introduction.
Yeah. Okay, that's very good. Thank you. So I tend to agree with what most people said here. Not to downplay Bjorn's point, but I definitely do think introduction is the most important, but only slightly. For the reasons you all said, which is very good, because then I can skip a lot of things I need to say. It saves me time. But in a sense that, just like what Bjorn said, conclusion is very important. People need to remember. If you forgot a few things in your body, let's say you have an argument that goes from A to Z, and you forgot some points in between. You forgot point D, you forgot point F, whatever. But that's not a problem, because if you have a good attention grabber, you tease the point at the start, and then you conclude it again, or you summarize it again at the end of your speech. People go like, oh yeah, he sort of made a good point. That's fine. right? Like, okay, I remember, yeah, we don't want obese children to be bullied into mental health care, into a depression. That's not a good thing. Right? So in that sense, conclusions are definitely very important. Not to say that body isn't, right? But if I were to rank them, introduction, then very closely conclusion, and then the body. Now, let's go into some, and you'll see this in the slides. You'll see that there are a lot of things about the introduction. There's even more about the body, but that will be handled in future lectures. And then a bit less about the conclusion. All right? Introduction. Grabbing the attention is very important because in the majority of the time, you're not dealing with a fully committed audience. It is critical, right? The second point, it is critical to grab the attention before you move on to certain parts. And just like what Louisa said and what Bianca said, it's if the audience member doesn't even know why they're here, who you are, what you're talking about, etc., then what's the point of even listening? And then they just leave, and then you've lost your audience. So you need to give a good introduction. That doesn't mean that you need to have a perfect attention grabber, you need to have the perfect joke, you need to have a lot of anecdotes or polls or etc. What it means is that you should still try to give a primer or an introduction in the sense of getting some attention. It doesn't have to be perfect, as long as people listen to you. Now, the best way to do that is priming the audience. Priming the audience is, if you listen to a lot of speeches, you'll recognize it. Indirectly preparing the audience for something. So making an anecdote, rhetorical questions like, hey, anybody here have a child? I have a child. Let's talk about child obesity. Like obviously. Or a direct primer, which is setting the tone for the speech. When you say like, oh, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering here. I have a very important point to make, which is about childhood obesity, which I believe is the next pandemic and cause of both mental health diseases in soon-to-be adults and rising costs in our healthcare costs. It's very important. People go like, oh, yeah, I'll listen. This is about my taxes, and this is about mental health. It's a big issue. We should talk about it. Right? You can give indirect primers or direct primers. It doesn't even have to be a joke. Some speech coaches, they might say like, oh yeah, just try to give a joke. No, a lot of people are not naturally funny when you have to prepare. We're not comedians. We give a speech. So try to think about what fits your speaking style. Purpose statements. Now, purpose statements is what I just did before. Like when I said like, hey, I am here to talk about childhood obesity. It's very important. Mental health, rising healthcare costs. I have 3 points: physical health, mental health, rising healthcare costs. You give a statement. This is bad for our country. You try to use your increased pitch. You try to use your volume. You try to use that pathos to go like, hey, this is bad. Statement. You don't have to flower it up like, oh, we're all gonna die. No, but still you can very clearly state it. Also, don't say it in a question. Is childhood obesity bad? Obviously it is. Okay? So try to make a clear statement. It doesn't have to be long, usually no more than a single sentence. Statements can be very, very effective in grabbing people's attention. In the introduction, you also need to give relevance and you need to give credibility. Now, the relevance tends to come from the logos part, right? You give, why do we care about this? Because this is bad for us. Okay. And then you argue why this is bad. Well, mental health is, a mental health epidemic is bad because people will kill themselves. That's logical. But you also need to make sure that the relevance is connected to a pathos conclusion. This is bad for us because we don't want people to die. We'll feel sad. This is a very basic explanation, but in essence, you're combining pathos and logos here. Now, the credibility part is basically saying, I'm a doctor, the part of this is very important, or I'm a statistician, I'm a researcher, and I've seen that the number of childhood obesity cases is rising. it's rising almost exponentially. Right? People go, oh, that's actually very bad. I'll listen to you. And you say you're a researcher, and you say you're a doctor. I'll listen to you. You're credible. So your introduction is very important in establishing all those things. Grab the attention, give the statement, and in those statements, you explain the relevance and the credibility. Now, the body is basically the arguments going from A to Z. How exactly does childhood obesity work? Why should we solve it? How do we solve it? And what is the solution compared to alternatives? Right? But this will be in the other lectures in the next coming weeks. And then you get to your conclusion. Now your conclusion, just to make it very clear, has 3 points instead of 4, like with the introduction. So your conclusion is 1, you summarize, hey, remember what I said about childhood obesity? 1, physical health of the child, 2, mental health, and 3, healthcare costs. Now, when it says here, don't make it a list, but a brief summary of what you said, is that you need to try to make it a conclusion or reference it back to the intro. Re-reference the original purpose of it. So don't say just word for word what I did, like only physical health, mental health, and rising healthcare costs. But instead you say physical health, that's bad. People are going to get crippled. They get diabetes. Remember, that's not a good thing. 2, mental health. People get depressed, suicidal. Again, that's horrible. We don't want to lose our family members and friends. This is bad. 3rd, remember what I said in the body? Rising healthcare costs. This is not good for our society. Insurance premiums are going to go up. Everyone is worse off for it. Remember that, right? So I'm not just making a list. I'm reiterating the conclusions of the body. And I'm also re-referencing the relevance of the introduction. So that people, basically what you're doing is you're closing the story. You're closing the loop. I'm explaining A to Z, and I'm referencing back to A why I should do this to begin with. Last one, memorable ending. That's nice, right? It's very usually an impassioned anecdote or a little bit of sort of free speech or an example, like, when I gave, I don't know, pretend I'm a doctor. When I gave help to that obese child, their life changed. They got fit. They got happy. They wanted to live, and then that person became a firefighter and helped other people. Right? That's usually what sometimes people like to hear. A memorable ending can help people realize, like, oh, it gives that extra connection, that extra bit of pathos, where they go, oh, this is very, very good. I like listening to you. This is wonderful. I agree with your point. We should stop or do our extra best to stop childhood obesity. Those are the elements of your conclusion. Is that clear so far? Yeah.
I have a short question about credibility.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not a doctor or an expert, but you heard it of someone else, can you say, I heard it from him, so it's credible? Or what would you say?
That's difficult. I would say not always. Usually what I do in those cases is that I rely more heavily on the pathos and logos parts. Because I would just say, like, hey, we all agree that childhood obesity is bad. And if I explain my logical reasoning as to why my solution is good, then I tend to be able to convince people. But that's not always going to happen. So, those 3 elements, they are part each of a good speech. So I would say what tends to happen is that you try to invite people who do have that credibility. So what you'll see politicians sometimes do, like, hey, I have a research here, or you reference or introduce a doctor, like, hey, this doctor talking about the pandemic, etc. Just like with the COVID response from this government in the Netherlands, where one of the previous COVID conferences, they explicitly invited the doctor themselves to speak, because they were like, I don't think you people like listening to me anymore. Here, listen to the doctor himself. Right? So basically you're borrowing the credibility. And that's a delicate line to thread. When do you talk yourself? When do you reference someone else? When do you invite someone else to talk for you? That comes with practice, but also from understanding your audience. In the Netherlands, I understand why the minister president did it, or why the cabinet invited the doctor to talk, because people were getting fed up with it. They don't want to listen to him anymore. You're not the doctor. You're not the boss of us. We didn't vote for you. Well, I mean, a part of the country voted for you, but not everyone. And so it's like, well, you know, people are getting impatient. Let's try and invite the doctor, recognizing the audience.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Because essentially I'm kind of done at this point. So let's, any questions about, you know, the debating workshop as the persuasion workshop, so this first lecture as a whole? No? Okay, well, it's almost 1:45. Jonah, I think you can explain this part, or?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you, Michael. That was an absolutely wonderful lecture. Also for everyone, because someone I think asked in the chat, I disconnected in the middle of it, but I was able to reconnect and continue recording. So there will be a single video recording that I'll upload later today. I just want to give a quick announcement for the workshop this Thursday. It's going to be at the same time, so from 7 to 8:45. Go to, if you're an ESE student, go to Canvas and look in modules to see what group you're in. It's already posted. And also then accompanying your assigned group is also the Zoom link to join your group. Michael will be one of the trainers on Thursday to be able to help you work on your speeches. To be able to participate in this workshop, you need to prepare a short 2-minute speech. The exact directions on this are on Canvas. It's very simple. You just have to write and tell a short story of any kind. It can be fake, it can be real, from your life, from someone else's life. Anything is acceptable, such that you're then going to be able to practice giving the speech on and work on your speaking style, and also all of the other things, speech anxiety, the basic structures of introduction, body, conclusion, that Michael has so wonderfully gone over today. Is there any questions about the workshop?
So when you say it can be about anything, you mean like anything? Like, does it not have to have a topic? You can just say what you ate for breakfast, or?
If you can tell it in a compelling story and you can make it in a way, I think in terms of persuasiveness, the point is that you're trying to persuade the audience to listen to your story. And a good story, I guess, should probably have some kind of meaning behind it. But the point, I think, is what I'm saying is you should not overthink and try to make something extremely impactful, as this is simply going to be a model for you to be able to practice giving a speech on.
All right,
okay.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and EDS, if you're an EDS student, directions and Zoom link will be sent to you individually, so don't need to worry. Yeah. So any questions then in general about the workshop, the class, or public speaking in general while we have Michael here?
It's more of a logistics issue, but at least for me, this workshop isn't showing up on my timetable.
Okay, why don't you send me an email specifically, and I will look into that for you.
I added also, but you can also see it on Canvas. There, the timetable is correct. So.
Yeah, I highly recommend looking at the so the homepage of Canvas has a schedule, and it will have all of for at least the lectures or workshops that everyone will be in a single group, all the Zoom links together, or all of the room information, as the room information will vary week to week once we become in person again. So I recommend that over the online schedule, that timetable that you have.
What about those of us who are not in economics but are from different faculties and are just here through debating society?
You aren't. So wait, you're not part of the debate society, and not in.
I am.
Oh, if you're in the debate society, Alan will send you information later today about how you can get access to the PowerPoints and all of the other files for this course. So that will be communicated to you directly.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Okay, any other questions?
If there are no questions, I can quickly re-summarize everything.
Yeah, of course. You can go right ahead, Michael.
So when I started this, I asked you, what did you think about persuasion? Can you persuade everyone? Yes or no, etc. But the most important part is realizing that when you have and you look at those specific base principled elements of a speech, ethos, pathos, logos, etc., and how they can be influenced by your speaking style, the various areas, your pitch, your volume, the way you stand, where you look, the movement of your body, your hands, and all those things, where people focus on, what kind of audience you're using, they all influence those three principles, with Kairos being the only one where you really prepare. But the most important part is that as long as you practice, that's really the one thing I really want to make clear and stress out, because especially structuring your speech with the introduction, body, and conclusion, when you really practice, it becomes very easy and you can fight that speech anxiety. But you need to practice a lot, right? But even practicing a few times, that's very good. So that's really the main takeaway of this. Practice if you want to be good. This is just theory. All right, I hope you all can make a nice 2-minute speech, and I think I'll see some of you on Thursday, so that'd be nice. And don't worry about failure, right? That's perfectly normal. I think I was really bad in my first 50 speeches, really bad. Like, wow, this is feces wrapped in a gift box. It was terrible. My first speeches were terrible, so don't worry about it. Any last questions? No?
No, but thank you so much for doing the course. It was really nice having you as a lecturer, professor, whatever.
Thank you. Yeah, it's only a bit of a shame we can't do it in an actual lecture hall, but this is fine too. So I enjoyed it as well. Thank you for this opportunity, Jonah. Thank you for organizing it, and I'll see some of you on Thursday. If you also any questions about the content, I mean, you can ask me, but you can also ask Jonah, who can forward it to me if he can't answer it. So that's perfectly fine. And if there's nothing else, I guess I'll say goodbye and see you next time.